July 11, 1947. The sea off the southern coast of France is quiet, silver under a rising moon. A single ship drifts in the harbor of Sète, rusted, uneven, its hull painted hastily with the name Exodus 1947. To most eyes, it is nothing more than a forgotten ferry, too old for service, too small for history. But tonight, it holds the heartbeat of a scattered people. 5,000 souls are crammed aboard. Men, women, children, the last survivors of a continent that had devoured them. They have no passports, no nation, only the faint conviction that beyond the horizon lies home. On deck, the air smells of salt, oil, and humanity. Blankets hang from railings. Babies cry softly, and the narrow walkways groan under the weight of life. Below, in the engine room, volunteers from the Haganah work silently. They are not sailors, not soldiers, but exiles who have become both. The engines throb unevenly, shaking the walls with every heartbeat. A mechanic wipes grease from his hands, glancing toward the hatch. He knows the British blockade waits beyond the French coast. Destroyers, patrol craft, searchlights sweeping the horizon like cold eyes. Above deck, passengers cling to the railings, their faces turned toward the dark sea. Among them are children born in camps, mothers with tattooed arms, old men clutching prayer books in languages the world no longer speaks. A young woman hums a tune from before the war, a lullaby drowned by the whisper of the wind. Every sound feels sacred. Every breath feels borrowed. Just before midnight, a small group gathers near the bridge. At their center stands Yossi Harel, the Haganah officer chosen to command the voyage. He looks impossibly young, his expression calm but unreadable. Around him, the crew listens as he reads the order. Destination, Palestine. Refuse interception. Protect the passengers. Document everything. The last line carries the most weight. The world must see. The engines roar to life, a low growl against the sleeping harbor. Ropes are cast off, the ship trembling as it begins to move. On the pier, French dockworkers watch in silence, their faces hidden in shadow. They know the risk. They also know why. When the Exodus clears the harbor mouth, someone on shore raises a hand. Not in farewell, but in faith. The ship lurches forward, its bow cutting through the dark. Behind it trails the wake of exile. Ahead lies the invisible wall of empire. On the horizon, faint lights flicker. British patrols guarding a coast they no longer own. The blockade is absolute. No refugee ship has passed in months. Those caught are sent to Cyprus or turned back to Europe. The empire believes it can contain desperation. It cannot. As dawn breaks, the passengers stir. Children blink in the new light. Mothers whisper prayers. Men stare eastward toward a land they have never seen, but always called home. The sea glows pale gold. A small flag flutters from the mast. A blue Star of David sewn by hand from scraps of cloth. It is unofficial, unauthorized, and unstoppable. Far astern, a thin column of smoke marks the movement of a British destroyer beginning its pursuit. The Exodus sails on, its decks crowded, its engines groaning, its mission clear. It is not just a ship. It is an argument made of steel and breath, proof that survival itself can be defiance. History moves quietly across the water, carrying those who have nothing left but the will to arrive. The war had ended 2 years earlier, but peace had not followed. Across Europe, the ruins of cities lay heavy with the silence of the dead. In displaced persons camps scattered through Germany, Austria, and Italy, hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors waited behind barbed wire, free from the Nazis, yet still imprisoned by the world's indifference. They were stateless, voiceless, unwanted. Governments argued over quotas and resettlement, while the survivors dreamed of only one place, Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. For many, it was not politics but prophecy, not strategy, but survival. They called themselves Ma'apilim, those who ascend, illegal immigrants to a homeland under foreign rule. Since 1939, the British White Paper had closed the gates of Palestine. Only a limited number of Jewish refugees were allowed entry, and that number had long been exhausted. Every ship that tried to break through was intercepted. Every passenger who reached the shore was sent to Cyprus, behind fences and guards, waiting for a future that never came. The empire ruled the sea, and the sea ruled the desperate. Yet the survivors did not wait. Beneath the surface of post-war Europe, an invisible operation began to move. A network of sailors, mechanics, teachers, and soldiers working under one name. Mossad LeAliyah Bet, the secret branch of the Haganah dedicated to bringing Jews home illegally. Their mission was simple and impossible: to outwit the Royal Navy and deliver their people to the Promised Land. They built routes across the Mediterranean, using fishing boats and cargo ships, each renamed, repainted, disguised. Crews were drawn from the Jewish Brigade, from veterans of Allied armies, from anyone willing to risk their lives for the nameless and forgotten. They met in dark cafes, abandoned ports, train stations where no trains ran. Every ticket, every forged paper, every radio code was a small rebellion. To the British, these were illegal immigration networks. To those who sailed, they were redemption. By 1947, the struggle had become a war of wills. The British Empire, exhausted from victory, still clung to the illusion of control. Its destroyers patrolled the coast of Palestine. Its officials in Jerusalem spoke of stability and order, and its soldiers guarded barbed wire camps on Cyprus filled with Holocaust survivors who had committed no crime except to live. The contradiction was unbearable. Inside the Haganah, the debate sharpened. Should they continue in secrecy, ship by ship, or challenge the empire openly? The answer came from David Ben-Gurion himself, the future prime minister. "The world must see what they are doing," he said. "Let them stop the survivors in daylight." The Mossad LeAliyah Bet began planning a voyage unlike any before. Not a small, hidden operation, but a deliberate act of defiance. They would send one massive ship, impossible to ignore, carrying thousands. It would not slip past the blockade. It would break it. The operation's goal was not only to bring people home, but to force the world to look, to confront the image of British soldiers turning back the remnants of a murdered people. It would be the greatest moral challenge to the empire since the war, and the birth cry of the nation to come. Across the ruins of Europe, word spread quietly. A ship is coming. Refugees began to move, by night, by train, by foot, toward the French coast. Families carried everything they owned in sacks and memory. For them, the journey was not political, it was sacred. The British called it smuggling. The survivors called it return. And somewhere in a Marseille warehouse, an old American ferry waited under a new name, rusting, unremarkable, and destined for history. The empire believed the sea would keep its secrets, but the exiles were already on their way. By the spring of 1947, the Mediterranean had become a chessboard of shadows. Every harbor, every cove, every fishing boat was watched. The British Mediterranean Fleet, headquartered in Haifa and Malta, enforced its blockade with ruthless precision. Orders were clear. No unauthorized vessels carrying Jewish immigrants were to reach the shores of Palestine. Destroyers prowled the coasts of Italy, France, and Greece. Spotter planes swept low over the water, scanning for ships too heavy or too slow to be fishing boats. Naval intelligence infiltrated ports, bribed dock workers, and followed rumors whispered in cafes from Marseille to Piraeus. They were chasing ghosts. Yet those ghosts kept returning, ship after ship, each filled with survivors who refused to stay in Europe. From January to May, 9 vessels were caught and diverted to Cyprus. More than 20,000 refugees languished behind barbed wire, guarded by soldiers who had once fought to liberate camps just like these. The British government defended the policy as necessary security, but photographs of the detention camps, the wire fences, the watchtowers, began to leak into American and European newspapers. The images were hauntingly familiar. In the offices of Mossad LeAliyah Bet, buried in the alleys of Paris, the frustration had turned to fury. Every intercepted ship meant more despair, more years lost behind fences. The movement's leaders gathered in secret to decide their next step. Yossi Harel, young and quiet, sat beside Shaul Avigur, the head of the operation. Maps covered the table, lines traced across the sea in red pencil, routes already closed. "There's no hiding anymore," Avigur said. "They know every path." "Then we stop hiding," Harel replied. The idea was audacious, to send a single massive ship carrying not hundreds, but thousands. Too large to conceal, too symbolic to ignore. It would be a message, not a smuggling attempt. The world would see the British blockade for what it was, the imprisonment of survivors by those who had once promised freedom. The risk was enormous. The Royal Navy was the most powerful in the world. A confrontation at sea could end in bloodshed. But for the Haganah, the alternative, silence, was worse. They would sail openly, under the gaze of journalists, Red Cross observers, and every moral conscience still awake after the war. Throughout the spring, the British tightened surveillance. They stationed destroyers near Cyprus, patrol craft off Haifa, and intelligence officers in every Mediterranean port. The Empire could feel something coming. It did not know when or from where, but it could sense the defiance gathering. In the camps of Europe, the refugees were restless. Rumors spread through the barracks. A large ship is being prepared, a ship that will take everyone. Men began to pack their belongings. Women mended clothes. Children learned the Hebrew songs whispered by underground teachers. Hope, once a dangerous illusion, returned like breath. By May, the Mossad had located the vessel, a retired American ferry called the President Warfield, abandoned in a Virginia shipyard and purchased through intermediaries. It was old, slow, and built for rivers, not seas. But it could carry thousands. Engineers were sent to refit her secretly in the port of Sète, France. Her name would change, her purpose reborn. The operation was given a simple code: Aliyah Gimel, the third immigration. As the first planks were replaced and the engines tested, British agents in Marseille began to take note. Reports reached London of unusual activity in French shipyards. The Admiralty dismissed them at first, another rumor among many. But the tone shifted when reconnaissance photos showed hundreds of people gathering near the docks. The Empire prepared to intercept. The sea would be sealed once more. But beneath the surface of that calm Mediterranean, something stronger than strategy was rising. The momentum of a people who had nothing left to lose. The blockade had never been tighter, and for that reason, the Exodus 1947 would be the one ship that refused to stop. The ship that would soon shake the empire began as scrap metal and memory. In a rusted dockyard near Baltimore, Maryland, the President Warfield had once carried tourists along the Chesapeake Bay. When war came, it ferried troops for the U.S. Navy, slow, dependable, unremarkable. After 1945, it sat abandoned, its paint peeling, its decks cluttered with rainwater and rust. But across an ocean, men and women searching for a vessel strong enough to carry a nation's hope saw more than decay. They saw a resurrection. Through a tangle of intermediaries and false companies, the Haganah purchased the ship under an assumed name, Fado Shipping Company. Its official destination, a commercial refit in France. The paperwork was flawless. On a cold February morning in 1947, American workers watched as the forgotten ferry slipped quietly down the Patapsco River, bound for the open sea. None knew that they were witnessing the beginning of one of the boldest acts of defiance in modern history. Weeks later, the ship arrived in Sète, a sleepy French port where fishermen and resistance veterans mingled in cafes still haunted by war. The harbor smelled of salt, diesel, and secrecy. There, under the cover of repairs, engineers began transforming the aging vessel into a lifeboat for 5,000 souls. Every bolt tightened, every plank replaced, was an act of rebellion. Volunteers from the Mossad LeAliyah Bet and the Palestine, the Haganah's naval branch, worked alongside American and French sympathizers. They stripped out the lounges and cabins, replacing them with bunks stacked 5 high. Storage compartments became kitchens. Lifeboats were converted into water tanks. They loaded sacks of flour, medical supplies, canned food, and thousands of life vests. Above deck, they welded makeshift railings, not for show, but to hold back the human tide that would soon crowd every inch. The refit was done in daylight, almost brazenly. British intelligence knew something was happening but could not prove it. The French authorities looked away, officially uninformed, unofficially sympathetic. They had seen too much suffering to enforce the letter of another empire's law. By June, the ship bore a new name, Exodus 1947, painted in white over the faded American letters. The choice was deliberate. It was not a disguise, but a declaration. Like its biblical namesake, the ship would carry a people out of bondage, across a sea, toward a land promised but still denied. The Haganah chose Yossi Harel, just 30, as commander. He had already overseen several successful Aliyah Bet voyages and carried the calm of a man who understood that failure could not be afforded. His deputy at sea would be Ike Aronovich, a 23-year-old Polish-born sailor who had survived the war and learned navigation in the British Merchant Marine. Together, they prepared not for stealth, but for confrontation. Refugees began arriving quietly at assembly points across France. They came from Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and the ruins of Germany. Families with suitcases, orphans with tags around their necks, the last fragments of a lost generation. They were trucked to Sète in the dead of night, hidden in barns by day. When they reached the docks and saw the ship, some wept, others prayed. To them, it was not rust and metal. It was salvation. On deck, volunteers organized food lines, medical stations, and children's quarters. Doctors drew up emergency plans, knowing the conditions would be unbearable. The crew handed out armbands marked Haganah, not for authority, but unity. Everyone aboard understood that the voyage ahead was illegal, dangerous, and sacred. From the air, British reconnaissance photographed the growing crowds at Sète. The Admiralty in London demanded answers. The French Ministry of Interior denied knowledge, the American press looked the other way, and the sea waited. On the night of July 10th, Harel gave the order, "Prepare for departure." The engines rumbled to life. The harbor lights dimmed as if in respect. No banners, no ceremony. Just the slow, labored movement of a ship carrying the weight of history. 5,000 refugees would soon press against her rails, staring eastward into a horizon they had never seen but had always called home. The British blockade was waiting, but so was destiny. Night swallowed the coast of France as the Exodus 1947 pushed away from the pier. The sea was black, the air heavy with salt and exhaust. On the quayside, the few French dock workers who had dared to help stood motionless, hands raised in silent farewell. They knew that what sailed from their harbor was not a voyage. It was a declaration. The ship moved slowly, her engines groaning under the weight of 5,000 lives. Every deck, every passageway, every stairwell was filled. The passengers were not sailors or soldiers, but the remnants of a people. Men who had worn prison uniforms, women who had walked through ashes, children born in silence, so as not to be heard. Now they were together, finally moving east, toward a promise older than memory. Below deck, the air was thick with heat and breath. There was barely room to sit. Bunks were stacked 6 high, sheets dividing families for privacy. The hum of the engines never stopped. It was the heartbeat of survival. Doctors and nurses, many survivors themselves, worked in narrow corridors, tending to the sick, rationing water drop by drop. Yet through the discomfort, something extraordinary took hold, life returning where death had lived too long. Each morning, the crew piped music through the loudspeakers. Hebrew songs carried across the decks like prayer. Children learned the words as they watched the endless horizon. On the main deck, a rabbi led brief services, his voice nearly lost to the wind. The people did not pray for safety. They prayed for arrival. In the radio room, Commander Yossi Harel and Captain Ike Aronowitz studied maps under red light. The course was direct. Across the Mediterranean, straight to Palestine's coast. No disguises, no detours. Every hour they transmitted coded messages to Mossad contacts on shore, reporting position and speed. They knew the British were listening, and that was the point. This voyage was not meant to hide. It was meant to confront. 3 days out, the first sighting came. A distant shape on the horizon. Gray, low, moving fast. A Royal Navy destroyer. Through binoculars, Aronowitz saw the flash of its signal lamp. A warning. You are entering a prohibited zone. Turn back immediately. He ignored it. The refugees cheered when they learned the British had found them. To them, interception meant recognition, that the world could no longer pretend not to see. As the destroyer drew closer, its guns remained silent. The Royal Navy had orders, intercept, but avoid bloodshed. The British officers watched through telescopes, unable to comprehend what they saw. A ship so overloaded it defied physics, every inch alive with faces. They could hear singing faint across the water, songs in a language the Empire had never ruled. Back aboard the Exodus, supplies ran thin. The kitchens worked without pause, boiling soup from seawater and ration flour. The heat below decks grew unbearable. Still, no one complained. The passengers took turns on deck, breathing the open air, gazing east. Every mile meant something immeasurable. At night, the crew maintained blackout conditions. No lights, no fires. The only glow came from the stars and the faint reflection of waves. The ship rolled with the current, groaning under the strain, but still moving forward. Children slept against their mothers' arms. The elderly whispered stories of cities that no longer existed. The sea became a living memory, vast, dangerous, and forgiving. On July 17th, they sighted Cyprus, the last obstacle before Palestine. Behind them, more British destroyers joined the chase. Ahead, the invisible line of the blockade. They could almost smell the land beyond it. Messages flashed across the waves, orders relayed from Haifa to the fleet. Intercept, board if necessary. Harel gathered the crew. They will come soon, he said. Do not fight to win. Fight to be seen. The passengers were told the same. They prepared for the inevitable not with weapons, but with will. The ship's loudspeakers played Hatikva, the hope. The melody rose softly, then louder, filling the decks, the water, the sky. That night, a flare appeared on the horizon, the signal of the British blockade. The destroyers closed in, lights sweeping the waves. The refugees lined the rails, eyes burning with fatigue and defiance. No one turned away. The Exodus had reached the edge of empire. What came next would burn its name into history. July 18, 1947. The Mediterranean dawned crimson, a sky half fire, half warning. On the horizon, 3 British destroyers moved in formation, their gray hulls cutting through the sea with the slow certainty of authority. Between them, like prey trapped in plain sight, the Exodus 1947 pressed forward, her decks packed with passengers who refused to bow. From the destroyer, HMS Ajax, a signal flashed in Morse. "Stop your engines! You are violating His Majesty's blockade." Captain Ike Aronowitz stood on the bridge, eyes fixed on the horizon. His jaw was set, his voice steady. "Keep course," he said. Around him, Haganah crew members waited for the inevitable. They had been trained for this, not to fight, but to endure. Below deck, the air thickened with fear and heat. Mothers clutched children. Doctors prepared makeshift stretchers. In the narrow corridors, volunteers distributed rags soaked in water to shield against tear gas. They knew what was coming. The Empire would not let them pass quietly. At 4:00 a.m., the British destroyers accelerated. Spotlights snapped on, slicing through the dark. Loudspeakers roared across the water. "Stop immediately, or we will board by force." The Exodus answered with silence. The first collision came minutes later. A thunderous impact as a destroyer rammed the ship's side, metal shrieking against metal. Refugees stumbled, screams rising from below. The British ship circled, striking again and again, their hulls scraping against the crowded vessel. On deck, Haganah crewmen braced with ropes, trying to keep the ship from capsizing. Then came the boarding. From every side, motor launches approached, packed with British Marines in helmets and flak jackets. They carried batons, tear gas, and shields. Some climbed up ropes thrown over the railings. Others jumped from the destroyers directly onto the deck. The Exodus's passengers met them not with weapons, but with resistance. Men and women swung tin cans, sticks, whatever they could find. Boiling water was thrown down stairways. Children cried, clinging to their mothers' legs. The deck turned into chaos, the smell of oil, sweat, and gas filling the air. A tear gas grenade exploded near the bow. Smoke billowed across the crowd. People coughed, eyes burning, yet no one fled below. They stood together, shouting in Hebrew and Yiddish, voices hoarse but unbroken. For many, it was the first time they had fought back, not to destroy, but to be seen. British Marines forced their way forward, clubbing through the resistance. On the bridge, Harel shouted orders, his voice drowned by noise. Aronovich tried to steer, but the wheel had jammed. A burst of gunfire, warning shots cracked above the din. A sailor fell. Another screamed. By dawn, the ship was theirs. The British flag replaced the blue Star of David fluttering on the mast. 3 passengers were dead. First Officer William Bernstein, a volunteer from California, and 2 refugees, both teenagers. Over 200 more were wounded. Blood streaked the wooden decks. The Marines stood amid the wreckage, faces grim, surrounded by the silent defiance of 5,000 people who refused to move. Cameras captured everything. Haganah couriers had smuggled journalists aboard before departure. Now the world would see what the blockade looked like. As the sun climbed higher, the British destroyers towed the battered Exodus toward Haifa. On deck, the refugees gathered bandaged and bruised, their eyes hollow but steady. They had lost the battle, but not the message. The ship was no longer a vessel. It was evidence. When the convoy reached Haifa, British soldiers lined the docks. Officials shouted orders, but no one moved until Harel gave the command. One by one, the passengers disembarked under guard, walking past cameras, reporters, and soldiers who did not meet their eyes. In London, the Admiralty called it an unfortunate but necessary action. In the camps and cafes of Europe, it was called something else, a disgrace. The British believed the matter closed. But the story of the Exodus 1947 had only begun. For in that moment, when the helpless fought back and the powerful were filmed striking them down, the balance of history shifted, and the Empire's victory began to look like defeat. The battle was over. The silence that followed felt heavier than gunfire. In Haifa's harbor, the Exodus 1947 lay crippled, her deck scarred, her hull bleeding rust. British Marines patrolled the gangways, their uniforms neat against the ruin of the ship they had conquered. Below them, 5,000 refugees waited under guard, their faces streaked with smoke and salt. The air stank of sweat, oil, and disbelief. They had come within sight of their promised coast, the Carmel Hills visible beyond the bay, but they were forbidden to step on it. The gates of home stood open before them, and they were being turned away. British officers read the orders aloud. The passengers would be transferred to 3 deportation ships and sent to Cyprus, where other refugees were held in camps. But as cables were exchanged between Haifa and London, the plan changed. Someone in Whitehall, perhaps seeking to teach a lesson, made a fateful decision. The refugees would not go to Cyprus. They would be sent back to Europe, back to the continent that had buried their families, back to Germany. The order spread through the ranks of the Royal Navy. Even among British sailors there was unease. The very idea seemed cruel beyond reason. Survivors of the Holocaust returned to the land of their tormentors. But orders were orders. The Empire still believed it could control the narrative. On July 19th, the passengers were forced to board 3 prison ships: Ocean Vigor, Runnymede Park, and Empire Rival. British soldiers herded them down the gangways, bayonets fixed, their faces hidden behind gas masks. Journalists recorded every moment. Women clutched children. Men carried the wounded. The British commander watched from the pier, his expression blank. From the decks, the refugees sang, hoarse voices, bruised but unbroken. Hatikva, the anthem of hope, rose above the harbor, carried by wind and defiance. Even the soldiers looked away. When the convoy departed, the sun was high. The ships steamed north, bound for Port de Bouc, near Marseille. The British government expected the refugees to disembark there quietly. They were wrong. The French refused to cooperate. When the ships anchored, the French dockworkers and police stood motionless, refusing to assist in unloading. The refugees declared a hunger strike. They would not step onto any soil but that of Palestine. The standoff lasted weeks. Temperatures rose. Food and water ran out. The ships became floating prisons, thousands of survivors trapped again, this time under the flag of their supposed liberators. The press swarmed. Life, the New York Times, and Le Monde published photographs of gaunt faces staring through iron rails. The world began to understand. When it became clear that no one would disembark, the British doubled down. The 3 ships received new orders. Proceed to Hamburg, Germany. Even some officers protested. One captain radioed his superiors, "They are Jews, sir. Survivors. Must we?" The reply came cold and immediate. "Proceed as ordered." As the ships entered German waters in early September, the passengers wept and sang. They saw the coastline not as return, but as accusation. British troops stood waiting in the harbor, rifles gleaming under floodlights. The refugees refused to walk down the gangplanks. They lay on the decks, locked arms, and shouted, "We will not go back!" Tear gas filled the air. Soldiers dragged them one by one, carrying women, kicking men, lifting children who screamed and clung to their mothers. Cameras flashed. Reporters wrote in disbelief, British soldiers forcing Holocaust survivors back into Germany. That image, uniforms, smoke, and despair, traveled across the world in days. Newspapers in New York, Paris, and Johannesburg printed it on front pages. Editorials condemned Britain's moral collapse. In Washington, President Truman's aides demanded explanations. In London, Parliament fell silent under the weight of shame. The Exodus 1947 never reached Palestine, but its journey home had become the world's conscience. The survivors were placed in internment camps near Lubeck, behind barbed wire once again. But this time, the fences could not contain their story. The British Empire had won the battle of ships and lost the battle of the soul. History had repeated itself. But now, the world was watching. The news spread like fire through a world still raw from war. Photographs from Hamburg of tear gas, barbed wire, and British soldiers dragging Jewish survivors off ships filled the front pages of every major newspaper. In the Times, the headline read, "Jews sent back to Germany." In the New York Herald Tribune, "Survivors of Hitler's camps imprisoned again by Britain." The shock was immediate, the outrage universal. How could the victors of 1945, who had liberated Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, now send the survivors of those places back to German soil? In the halls of power, silence replaced certainty. British diplomats scrambled to justify the decision as logistical necessity. Admiralty spokesmen spoke of illegal immigration and maintaining order, but the words rang hollow. The images had done what words could not. They revealed the human cost of empire's cold arithmetic. In Washington, President Truman's advisors pressed him to act. The moral position of the United States, one aide wrote, cannot survive association with this policy. American journalists stationed in Europe described the scene as a moral collapse greater than any military defeat. Truman himself, already critical of Britain's Palestine policy, demanded that Jewish refugees be admitted immediately. London refused. Across France and Italy, dock workers went on strike, refusing to service British vessels. In Cyprus, British soldiers at detention camps received letters from home questioning what they were doing. One wrote in his diary, "They told us we were peacekeepers. Now we are jailers." The empire, still vast in reach, began to feel the first tremors of exhaustion. At the United Nations, the Exodus incident became a point of reckoning. Delegates from small nations, Costa Rica, Guatemala, the Philippines, rose to speak words no empire could dismiss. If even the survivors are refused a homeland, what lesson remains from this war? In Palestine, the Yishuv, the Jewish community under British rule, followed every dispatch with grim pride. The Haganah printed clandestine pamphlets titled "The Ship That Defied an Empire." They circulated through kibbutzim, synagogues, and underground schools. For them, the Exodus was more than a ship. It was a mirror of their struggle, the proof that the moral high ground now belonged to those who had none. Among the refugees in Germany, resolve replaced despair. They refused to leave the camps. They painted Hebrew words on the barracks walls. "We will return." They held lessons for children, planted gardens, raised flags of their own making. Even surrounded by guards, they were already free in spirit. British officers, bound by orders but haunted by conscience, filed reports filled with unease. One described the prisoners as quiet, disciplined, and unbroken. Another admitted privately, "We have lost their fear. They no longer see us as power, only as obstacle." The moral tide turned swiftly. British public opinion fractured. In Parliament, critics demanded accountability. In the streets, protesters carried placards reading, "End the blockade." The empire's own citizens could no longer bear the sight of survivors behind fences paid for by their taxes. The Exodus affair had done what no military confrontation could. It transformed the Jewish struggle from a regional rebellion into a global cause. For the first time, the question of a Jewish homeland was not buried in diplomacy, but burned into conscience. In the weeks that followed, committees in the United Nations began drafting a new proposal, one that would divide the land of Palestine into two states, one Arab, one Jewish. The debate was fierce, but the momentum irreversible. The world's empathy, awakened by the photographs from Hamburg, now carried political weight. In the ruins of the Exodus's voyage, the impossible had happened. A ship that never reached its destination had moved the world closer to justice. The refugees, still behind fences in Germany, did not know this yet. But their suffering had become testimony. Their silence had become sound. The British blockade still held the sea, but it no longer held the moral current. That current was now flowing toward independence. Autumn settled over Europe, carrying with it the quiet fatigue of empires grown old. In London, the corridors of Whitehall echoed with unease. The Exodus 1947 affair had broken more than a policy. It had broken the illusion that Britain still ruled with moral authority. Cabinet meetings stretched late into the night, their tone shifting from defense to doubt. The question that could no longer be avoided now hung over every report. Had the British mandate itself become untenable? Field dispatches from Palestine offered no comfort. The Haganah's underground network had grown into a disciplined force. British convoys were ambushed on desert roads. Police stations were bombed in reprisal for arrests. The country was slipping from control, and across the world the image of the Exodus still burned. Jewish refugees behind British barbed wire staring silently into the camera lens of history. Prime Minister Clement Attlee received letters from bishops, writers, and war veterans condemning the government's actions. Even members of parliament from his own party demanded inquiry. The editorials no longer debated policy, they pleaded for conscience. "The war was fought to end this," wrote one. "We have become what we once opposed." In the Mediterranean, the Royal Navy still enforced the blockade, but with hesitation. Commanders avoided engagement whenever possible. Sailors whispered about the ship that shamed us. Each new interception brought protest, and every protest chipped away at Britain's standing in the world. The empire was bleeding legitimacy, one photograph at a time. Meanwhile, in the camps of Lubeck, the Exodus refugees endured another winter. Snow gathered along the barbed wire, the cold biting through thin blankets. Yet within those fences, a different power stirred. Not rebellion, but resilience. Teachers began classes in Hebrew. Children learned the geography of a land they had never seen. The Negev, Galilee, Jerusalem. Every lesson was an act of defiance. They were no longer refugees, they were citizens waiting for recognition. The turning point came in November. After months of deliberation, the United Nations convened in New York to decide the fate of Palestine. Delegates debated maps and boundaries, but in their speeches, the name Exodus appeared again and again, not as ship, but symbol. The moral weight of its story hung over the room like smoke. When the vote was cast, 33 in favor, 13 against, 10 abstaining, the result stunned the world. Resolution 181, the partition of Palestine and the creation of a Jewish state. The galleries erupted in cheers, the corridors filled with weeping and disbelief. Outside, journalists transmitted the headline that would echo across continents: "The nations vote for Israel." In London, the Foreign Office read the news in silence. There was no speech, no argument left. Britain's empire in the Middle East had reached its twilight. The mandate would end. The last soldiers would sail home within months. The Exodus 1947, though broken and grounded in Haifa's harbor, had outlived the blockade that stopped her. Her rusting hull became a relic of conscience, a monument to endurance disguised as a shipwreck. For the Jewish Agency, it was proof that faith could bend power. They had not defeated the British with arms or armies, but with something stronger: the world's awakened memory. The refugees of the Exodus had turned suffering into a weapon that no fleet could counter. As 1948 dawned, Britain prepared its withdrawal. Commanders burned files, dismantled offices, and packed crates onto the same ships that had once carried refugees back to Europe. The empire that had once drawn the map of the Middle East was erasing itself from it. And in the silence left behind, a new sound began to rise. The hum of preparation, the whisper of an independence not yet declared, but already inevitable. The survivors who had sung on the decks of the Exodus would soon sing again, not as refugees, but as citizens of a nation born from the defiance of one voyage. The blockade had broken the ship, but the ship had broken the empire. Years passed, and the Mediterranean forgot many names, but not this one. The wreck of the Exodus 1947 rested quietly in Haifa's harbor, her hull rusted to the color of dried blood. Waves washed through her empty corridors, whispering the echoes of 5,000 voices. Children once born on her decks now walked the streets of a free land. The sea, at last, had delivered them home. The State of Israel declared its independence on May 14, 1948. For those who had sailed aboard the Exodus, the moment felt both triumph and requiem. They had not reached the shore when they wished to, but their struggle had made that shore possible. Every scar on that ship had carried a message, and the world had finally read it. The Exodus never sailed again, but her story moved, from newspapers to classrooms, from whispers to songs. Survivors spoke of nights when the sea was black and endless, when hope seemed smaller than the stars, yet still refused to drown. Teachers told children how an empire with warships and borders had been undone by faith, by endurance, by a rusted ferry that carried no weapons but truth. In Haifa, fishermen still pointed out the shadow of her hull below the waves, calling it the ship that brought a nation home. Tourists saw only steel and salt. Israelis saw a beginning, a reminder that freedom is not born from power, but from persistence. The men who commanded her, Yossi, Harel, Ike Aronovich, and the volunteers of the Mossad LeAliyah Bet, returned to lives defined by quiet service. They did not call themselves heroes. When asked what they remembered, Harel once said only, the sound of 5,000 people breathing the same word, home. That sound became part of Israel's memory, as inseparable from its birth as the ink of its declaration. Each year, when students read about the struggle for independence, they read also of the Exodus, the ship that did not win by arriving, but by refusing to turn back. The British Empire is gone now. Its ports quiet, its flag folded, its maps redrawn. But the sea remembers. It remembers the night when power met conscience, when destroyers surrounded a ferry and found not enemies, but witnesses. It remembers the song that rose from a ship packed with exiles, carried on the wind like a vow. The waves still break against that coast, as they did when the Exodus appeared on the horizon. Battered, slow, unstoppable. The same water that once carried soldiers and blockades now carries trade, travel, peace. But beneath its calm surface lies a truth written in the rhythm of tides, that no empire endures against human will, and no barrier can hold forever against return. The voyage of the Exodus 1947 did not end in Haifa or Hamburg. It ended in every home built by those who once slept beneath her decks, in every child who speaks the language their parents whispered across the sea. History remembers the great battles, but sometimes the war for dignity is won by a single ship, crowded, broken, and unafraid. The Exodus carried no flag of victory, only a people and the promise they refused to surrender. They came as refugees, and the sea made them a nation.